Greetings. I'm Raymond Richard Neutra, president of the Neutra Institute for Survival Through Design, whose mission is to preserve the Neutra legacy and to use that legacy to promote creative research and design that benefits people and the planet. And I'm very grateful to be here today with Professor Victor Regnier, who is a professor at the School of Architecture and the School of Gerontology at USC, and who's had a long career in thinking about the physical settings and services that could go to make a graceful aging. And in 2018, his most recent book is Housing for an Increasingly Older Population, Redefining Assisted Living for the Mentally and Physically Frail. The book covers many strategies internationally. And today, though, we're going to focus on staying in one's own home. Now, modernist homes were, particularly in the United States, marketed for young people. But those young people are now in their 90s. And so staying in a modernist home has its own unique opportunities and problems. But Professor Regnier is going to tell us about aging in one's own home.
All right. Thank you very much, Raymond, for inviting me to have this conversation with you. It's really takes my two favorite things and combines them. So it's a wonderful opportunity to talk about it. I thought it might be useful to say a few words about aging in general, because I think it's important for us to recognize that things are changing here in the United States and around the world. And there are many more older people today than there have ever been. And it appears as if that increase is going to be even greater in the future. And it's not just the United States. In fact, comparatively, we're a relatively young society. But places like China, which you would not guess would have a aging problem, has an increase in the older population that's almost twice the rate as ours is in the United States. So many people in China are very worried about what's going to occur in the next in the next 10 years or 15 years or 20 years. And so anyhow, we want to talk a little bit today about those kinds of issues, and it's always good to start with some of the facts. So why are we in this situation? Well, one of the reasons is that we've experienced greater life expectancy, and so as you can see from this graph on the left-hand side, just over a very relatively short period of time, from 1950 on, you can see what is happening. But that growth in life expectancy is something that can be traced back to 1850, when we started to have changes that were taking place in cities that related to public health. And we have seen this unbelievably strong kind of increase in the number of, in the average age of individuals in society. And the main reason that it's become more of a problem for us is that we don't have as many replacements. That is, we have a much lower fertility rate as well. So the increase in life expectancy and the decrease in the fertility rate has really what has caused this kind of very quick increase in the percentage of people over the age of 65, 75, and 80. And as you might expect, housing is a pretty important component of aging in general. And when we do research in this area and we look at how and what defines a acceptable kind of housing environment, These are the four issues that appear to be the most important. That is, having a place where you can connect with other people your age, being able to eat healthy foods, and to do that in a way that's appropriate, participating in exercise and physical therapy, and then just avoiding injury, because as you age, the number of chronic conditions that you have increases as well. So those are the things that we're trying to juggle and keep in the formula here. One issue, of course, is to make certain that people take as much opportunity as they can to advocate for themselves. And we find that encouraging people to do as much as they can for themselves, and also to feel uh, the necessity of really managing their life is a very important consideration. It seems silly that we would have to mention that, but often society tends to take away those responsibilities for older people as they age, and it's not a good thing. We have a relatively mature collection of information, good research, and data that deal with the idea of accessibility. And you probably know the term universal design. And the idea here is to have an environment which works for young people and for older people, and can be adjusted in a way over time so that that fit can be made more appropriate. Uh, the probably one of the biggest problems that is very hard to deal with in housing is if someone finds themselves in a wheelchair. And we one of the things that we are always worried about is having enough space within the house so that access is facilitated. And bathrooms and kitchens are the two places where it seems like we have the most need for home modifications, and where we have the greatest number of conflicts. Now, it's important to know that just because we have these ADA standards, that doesn't solve a lot of problems, because most of the housing stock that older people live in is itself old, and and the outcome is that there are often smaller rooms and less commodious circulation spaces, and so we have to kind of keep that in mind. But if we look at just the ADA standards, it's not really exactly the best way to think about how to make adjustments to your own home. There are standards now called visibility standard or visitability standards, which actually measure how what the minimum constraint would likely be for somebody in a wheelchair. So in a wheelchair, which some people find themselves in as a result of increasing chronic impairment, we need to think about how to make adjustments in the environment to modify that. And some of it has to do with where the chair kind of places you in terms of access to storage or to workplaces like the kitchen counter, for example. But let's just talk briefly about what we need in order to stay at home for a much longer period of time. And I might say that this is something that is more relevant today than it ever has been, not only because of the pandemic and our thinking about staying in our own home for a longer period of time and managing that in a way that works, but also there is a stronger a system for services and support that makes it easier to stay at home as well. Some of that occurred as a result of the pandemic. Various kinds of services that are now home delivered that prior to that had not been. But if we look at this list of 8 things, it gives us a little bit of a better idea of what's kind of happening out there. Well, the first is what I just kind of referred to, that idea of home care service delivery. So you can make adjustments to the home and you can make it, quote, accessible, but that doesn't mean that you're going to be able to live in that setting with all of the accoutrements that are necessary to support life. And what we find interesting is that some societies have identified this as being a rather important issue. In Northern Europe, for example, it's been the case for more than 40 years that home care has been the preferred option for older people, making adjustments to the home in order to make it easier for them to live there for as long as possible. The good news is that in the United States, we're also seeing that change with adjustments in the Affordable Care Act and with attitudes about how we should ourselves as a society make it a more level playing field so that people can stay at home rather than move to a nursing home or a housing environment with a heavy layer of services. Sometimes it's not possible to accommodate that because people are extremely frail. Um, but today it's easier for people to stay at home than it ever has been in the past. And we have places like Sweden and Denmark and Norway and Finland to look to understand how they have been able to manage that well. The other thing that's occurring is that we're seeing all kinds of possibilities, both in the area of AI and robotics, which are really just kind of going to be around the corner, I believe, that will make it easier for people to stay at home as well. These are some of the adjustments that can be made, some electronic, some fairly straightforward, like widening doors and, um, and placing grab bars in the right location. Um, but we also have a new generation, really, of robotic devices. The one on the left hand side is called the Robear, and it's a first generation lifting device, which is made to look like a bear. Mostly to make it seem a bit more friendly as well. But these kinds of devices are probably, 5 to 7 years away in the future. Whereas AI and some of the aspects associated with AI, which can be useful in many, many different ways, seem as if they're almost around the corner. Uh, if we look at societies that have done this exceedingly well, Denmark is probably the best place to study. And they have a whole system of internet monitoring, which has been fully implemented in the last 3 to 5 years. And it makes it much easier to keep tabs on people and to combine home visits with also check ins that make it both less expensive and also make it easier to help people stay at home for a longer period of time. We have programs in the United States that are not all quite as robust as we would like them to be. Um, One of the best ones is called PACE. It's short for Program of All Inclusive Care, and there are about 120 programs throughout the United States, 230 centers, PACE centers that are available, and they're helping 40,000 people stay in their own homes for a much longer period of time. This one happens to be the Brandman Center, which is sponsored by the Los Angeles Jewish Home, and it's a quite a good and remarkable, I think, exemplar for us here in Los Angeles. The orientation is toward the community. They happen to be located in Reseda, and so people who are living in single family houses, some of which are very frail, have their services coordinated by this center, and then a couple of times a week, sometimes 2 or 3 times a week, they will be picked up and taken to the Bredman Center, where it's possible for them to interact with one another, like you would find in a senior center. But at the same time, there are physicians and physical therapists and dental hygienists and a whole range of therapists and doctors. This one is done in conjunction with UCLA that are able to check on people. And that's the problem when you become very old and very frail. You can't just go to a doctor once a year and think that's going to do the trick. There has to be, on an ongoing basis, some monitoring of those conditions. And this is a really great way to do that. So it takes care of that service component that we were talking about. Now, you hear a little bit now in Los Angeles about accessory dwelling units. It's in the news because we have all kinds of new planning standards and regulations that have allowed the construction of these small units, some in the range of 400 to 500 square feet, and have allowed those to be placed on larger single family lots, so somebody can live in a larger home and can also have a grandparent or a relative, a very old frail relative living with only a few feet away, a few steps away. And now this idea is again one that has been popular in Canada and the UK for 25 to 30 years and incredibly successful. But for some reason, we just discovered it and have allowed it to flourish. But we think that this is also going to have all kinds of positive impacts on the city of LA. It will help us to create new housing without having to place that in a huge housing project in the middle of a mature neighborhood as well. So it's a great way to increase density, and it's also a great way to have a way to help families as well. This is a ADU unit, just as an exemplar, again, a very contemporary one that we see being marketed here in Los Angeles by a whole range of providers. So I think there could be many choices that are available, and they'll make it possible to fit on various parcels and to make it flexible enough so that it can be assembled in a way that works for everyone. The other, this is another idea which has been around for a very long time, but hasn't really been recognized until quite recently. And that is multi-generational housing. And as you can see from the percentage up here, 18% or 57 million of the 330 million Americans that live in our country live in multi-generational housing where there's more than one generation living together. And now providers, producers of housing have discovered that this is a really strong and viable market. And so in this case, Lanier, which is a very large national, international developer, and Pardee, which is a local California home builder, have started to look at ways in which a small house of between 600 and 800 square feet can be coupled to a larger house. In this case, in the example, 1,700 square feet, but it can be much larger, 2,000, 2,500 square feet or whatever, so that you can have this possibility of somebody that's living connected really to your housing unit. And what they have discovered so far, these have been around for about 5 to 7 years. They've discovered that they are quite popular. There's a really strong kind of resale market for this as well. So I suspect we're going to see more of this in the future. Again, as you might suspect, most of this housing is being built on the periphery, not in areas that are already developed, but on the kind of exurban areas of the city. We have also a lot of new programs that are out there. This one's called the Village to Village Network. There are about 350 of these programs throughout the United States. They're designed really to create opportunities for people to help other people maintain their independence in a neighborhood as well. And we know that there are certain things that are necessary to be able to do this well. Transportation and access to home care are the two most important components, and, um, and these have been very, very successul in doing that in a way that's highly decentralized and doesn't really involve any kind of a government-sponsored support mechanism. It's really volunteers who are enlisted in helping people in their own neighborhoods. It's a very interesting program, and you'd be surprised to see how many of them are already existing in your own neighborhood. If we look at it from a kind of world perspective, what we do know is that the WHO has an initiative called Age Friendly Cities, and this is oriented to a lot of cities, both first and third world countries as well, where there isn't that much housing with services that have been produced and are available. And the big idea here is to make adjustments to the city itself so that the city can support independence for older people for a much longer period of time. We're of course behind the pace here compared to our European and Canadian neighbors that have used this program in the last 15 to 20 years. But we're coming late to the party. But cities like Los Angeles and Chicago and New York have really pretty well developed programs, as well as smaller communities as well. So there is a move afoot here to try and figure out how the city itself can be adjusted, whether that's transportation systems or walkable um, streets and pathways, or looking for ways in which civic participation can take place. Maybe it's through the local library or through a continuing education program at a local university. All of these are tied to this big idea of age-friendly cities. Now, there are a lot of, I know some of you are curious about how this might relate to yourself. This is a collection, I think, of really good documents that you can look through if you're curious about what are the things that need to be adjusted in order to make a home as accessible and safe as possible. And starting at the top are very simple lists of less than 8 to 10, and then there are much more in-depth checklists of about 50 to 60 items. There's an architectural digest home that was developed as a universal design living laboratory, quite beautiful and quite carefully and thoughtfully assembled. And then ARP and others have also gone on, have joined the bandwagon with ADUs and universal design, and there's a lot of good information out there. I got these from Julie Overton, who you can also email, and she is at the Gerontology Center at the Fall Prevention Center of Excellence at USC, and would be happy, I think, to talk with you about some of the choices and some of the other materials that are available. All right. Well, with that,
Thank you, Victor. It's a wonderful tour of a range of issues. I thought that I would chime in a little bit about how the Neutra legacy relates to this issue. Um, the how does modernism relate to this issue? You had made the point to me at one point that the case study houses in housing in the early 50s actually presented certain challenges that maybe other kinds of, let's say, Victorian houses did not. This is the Pierre Koenig's, I think it's case study house number 22, and this is the original owner who was aging in that house. You want to tell us a little bit about what those special challenges of a mid-century modern were?
Well, I think a lot of the housing that was produced after the Second World War, because we had a similar kind of housing crisis like we're experiencing today. We didn't have homelessness, but we had all of these GIs that were coming back. And we had 12 years of depression and low housing production, and there really wasn't any place for them to live. And so we saw, that's why the Case Study House program was so popular. It was perfectly timed to a crisis, a housing crisis. Now, one of the aspects associated with the case study houses that I think makes them both incredibly inventive and interesting is being able to design and make a housing environment function with very little space. It's something actually that Richard Neutra cared deeply about as well. His experimental VDL house really was set up in a way to make a small environment seem much larger. So in the Stahl's bedroom here, you have a mirrored wall on one side. You have a transom light between the two bedrooms that make that create a kind of continuity between the ceiling plane, making the room itself seem much larger. And of course, this house is surrounded by glass with great views of the city. But if you go and check out the bathrooms here or the kitchen, it's pretty small. And if you look at a lot of the housing, not just by a really talented architects, but the production housing that was created after the war, it also suffers from having bathrooms, for example, with 2-foot 4-inch entry doors, making it almost impossible for somebody to come into that space, either in a walker or a wheelchair. So part of the problem is that we got some spaces, and in a house or a dwelling unit of any sort or apartment, it's the kitchen and the bathroom that are the two problematic spaces. Those are the two that really need to be designed in a way to make it easier for people to live independently.
So, not all modernist houses have a problem of space. This is Rem Koolhaas's Maison Bordeaux that was designed for a gentleman who was paraplegic. And here's the view that he had. And my wife Peggy is looking up at the floor of a elevator, which is basically the floor of an entire room that moves across 3 levels. And on the left-hand side, you can see that this gentleman could push a button and get to the top shelf of his library if he wanted to, or move to another floor. And of course, he had a wonderful bathroom with shower and wheelchair access to the toilet. There are a number of Neutra clients of the late 50s who are now in their 90s that have continued to live in their Neutra houses. This is Mrs. Auerbacher. Tom Hines, who wrote the definitive history on my dad, lives in a Neutra apartment. And if you look to the left there, you can see that gray shroud is a wheelchair seat that his disabled son used to get up to the apartment, but if Tom ever needed it, he could too. And this would be the environment that he would see on the second floor in the treetops. Mr. Sale, who died a couple of years ago, lived in this house from the late 50s on and was able to be cared for there with this view outside. And the Browns in Washington, D.C. had this beautiful house in the late 60s. and have spent their aging years there. And my chemistry professor, Corwin Hatch, had a beautiful Neutra house in Pomona and ended his life there. So it is possible to age in a modernist house. Um, One that is particularly interesting is a spec house built in 1950 for this gentleman, Mr. Johnson, who built it to sell it with a very interesting program. It was called Reunion House, and the Neutra Institute has inherited the stewardship of this place. Um, and the program was this, that Grandma and Grandpa would be living in one wing of the house, and then there would be a living room, and in the other wing, including the kitchen and the garage with a separate entrance and a yard, were for the visiting children and grandchildren who could come, let's say, to visit Grandma and Grandpa in Los Angeles and go to Disneyland when they wanted to, and they could all coexist together. There was this interesting bathroom which was set up with a little room for the toilet and another room for the bathing, and then two sinks so that a number of different people could be brushing their teeth, taking a bath, and going to the toilet all at the same time. And this is the view from that living room to an intimate patio. And when the VDL studio residence part of it burned in 1963, my parents came and bought this house. It happened to be on the market. Here's my dad in the bedroom there with its characteristic spider leg increasing the size. And the idea for the original design was that there would be another bedroom, maybe for more grandchildren, on top of the garage. But when my brother Dion bought the house in the mid-60s, he decided to build what amounts to an ADU, a 500 square foot little bachelor apartment, which looks like this from the outside. And this is the view that you have out into the treetops again, making a very spacious experience in a 500 square foot studio apartment. It happened that both my 93-year-old brother and his wife were in hospice care, and the family would visit them. They moved hospital beds into that living room, and here is my brother at the end of his life listening to a guitar concert from his son Nick. And maybe you could comment, Victor, on the floor plan and the kind of modifications that you might think of to make this work.
Yeah, well, to start with, let's face it, it's an absolutely stunning house, both in terms of how light enters from two sides and the kind of control views that are available. And that was the brilliance of Richard Neutra, was his ability to both appreciate and understand how important plant materials were, to have a kind of complete life and to have access to the outside as well. So when you have big rooms, a room that combines the dining room and the living room, which, by the way, you wouldn't have in a Victorian house, you have some flexibility associated with it. So the fewer the number of partitions, the easier it is actually to create a plan that flows a bit more effectively. Now, here, probably the big bottleneck is the corridor to the toilet and to the bathtub and the sink. And that's what I was saying that was great about these architects. They understood exactly how many inches you needed in order to do that adequately. But it sometimes doesn't work out quite as easily if you are aging and in a wheelchair or have the need for a walker or some other device. Now, having said that, there are a lot of things that you can do, a lot of adjustments, a lot of changes that can be made, some of which are not that expensive either. Uh, you can, if you want, like in this case, the idea, I don't know if it was done this way just to make the plan easier to read, but without doors to start with, or creating a door with an offset hinge allows you an extra inch and a half to get through. So there are ways in which you can make adjustments to doors and to corridors in order to make them more accessible. This one has a closet that shares the hallway connection to the bedroom, which could also be taken apart and could be made much thinner. You know, a normal closet is 24 inches deep, but clothing usually is 18 inches deep, right? Unless you've got a big, huge jacket or something like that. We don't have that many in Southern California. But that can be 6 to 8 inches more compact and can work quite effectively with a much thinner kind of fabric covering or whatever. So there are a lot of ways in which you can intervene that can make these these spaces work very effectively. But I must say, this is just like the photograph that you showed of Dion in the hospital bed, which was possible to do because you had this very large living room, dining room area. Being able to oversee and to take in the view with a totally floor to ceiling transparent window wall. It's pretty hard to beat. Pretty nice.
So I'm an old guy too. I'm 82, and my wife Peggy and I took care of our previous spouses who died, and we realized that we could do that in our late 60s, but not in our 80s. So we chose another solution, which is the continuing care retirement community. In this particular one, Canterbury Woods near Monterey, we chose because we liked the fact that they had beautiful openings to patios, and that we could hobble down a couple of blocks to downtown Pacific Grove and get a cup of coffee after we stopped driving, or we could walk to Monterey Bay on one side and the Pacific coast at Asilomar Beach on the other. And what we hadn't quite anticipated was that our golden retriever was a magnet for other people, and we've found ourselves with a whole new set of interesting friends that we would never have had if we stayed home. And that they're convivial get-togethers. This is the birthday party for everybody in October, and musical events and physical therapy and physical exercise events which are possible in that kind of setting. So there are many ways to skin this cat, and I think that those of us who are had lived in modernist houses can choose either to stay there and figure out a way to make it work, or to go to other solutions. And I think I would say this is survival through design.
Well put. I must say that these units, like a continuing care retirement community unit, is usually custom fitted to the individual. It's not huge. You're coming out of a 2,500 to 4,000 square foot house. You don't need all of that space. You don't have that extended family anymore. But you need to have an accessible bathroom, and you need to have a kitchen that has all the reach capacities that work quite effectively. So they're really great examples if you want to study them of how these particular rooms have been right sized for accessibility while downsizing the unit itself to something that's really more manageable and more appropriate. And of course, in a continuing care retirement community, you have the option of professional management, where home care services can even be organized and delivered to the individuals that are living there. It's just a pretty exceptional um, option for people. Expensive and sometimes not quite as accessible financially to the hordes of older people that we have in this country. But they're exceptional places to get to age because of what you said. The dog ended up being your kind of connector to people, but at the same time, you met other people. You develop new friendships, and that's what's really great about a community like that. You aren't sitting by yourself watching TV. You're really engaged in life, and you're connected to other people. And we know that makes a huge difference in terms of both the quality and quantity of years that you have. So you made a good choice.
Right. Thank you so much.